So when I was 17, my older sister, Anne, was riding her bike, got hit by a car, and died. And it happened just like that. It happened suddenly. It happened without warning. And she was 27 years, 6 months, and 21 days old. So at the age of 17, I started thinking a lot about what I wanted to do with my life and what I wanted to do by the time that I was my sister's age. And I thought, I want to change the world. I want to make the world a better place. Okay, awesome. So what am I good at? And what I was good at is I was really good at talking about sex. And the reason for this was at the age of 16, my school had put on a production of the Vagina Monologues. And I grew up in San Francisco, and I went to a very liberal high school. And there were 3 of us, and we split up the monologues among us. And one of the monologues was about the clitoris, and how the clitoris is an amazing organ in the female body that has twice the nerves of the penis, and how it is the only organ in the male or female body devoted entirely to sexual pleasure. And I thought, how cool is that? How totally awesome is it that this exists? And how is that nobody told me about this before, right? And what else are they keeping from me? And so I began to research, and I went out and I read every single romance novel in my library branch, and I looked at everything online, and I went into Borders, and I would go into sort of the human sexuality section and steal books and put them behind other books and read them in the coffee shop. And I read and I read, and I got so excited about this idea of sex and about what sex would be. And it was going to be something magical and beautiful and intimate, right? That 2 people could share to show love for one another. That 2 people could share to create life. That people could share to create passion. And I was so excited for my life and the life of my friends. And I was so excited for what my first time would be like. And then my first time happened. And it was without my consent. It was against my consent. And while I had pictured my virginity as being this gift that I was going to give to somebody who I really cared about at the right time, it was instead something that was taken from me. And instead of the first phone call being to my best friend to dish about what had just happened, my first phone call was to my pediatrician to ask her for a prescription to Plan B, because at the time you had to have a prescription in order to get emergency contraception. And this is my first time sharing this story publicly. And I'm sharing it today because it doesn't feel like it's just my story, because so many types of unconsensual sex happen to so many of us. And it is our story. Now, part of the problem that we as a society face is that we don't really talk about unwanted or unconsensual sex. And when we do talk about it, we often talk about it in very confusing and very different ways. So when I say sexual assault, what most people think of is they think of a guy in a dark alley with a knife or a gun to the head of a woman and forcing her to have sex with him. And that is not what makes up the majority of sexual assaults, and that's not what makes up the majority of non-consensual sex. And there are all types of non-consensual and unwanted sexual acts. There are types where somebody says yes, but they don't really mean it. There's types when somebody says no, but is ignored and continues to have pressure put on them, and they figure it's easier just to give in than to keep fighting. There are times when people say no and are ignored, and things happen so quickly that they don't really have time to react or define what's happening to them as something that shouldn't be happening. There are times when people say no and say no and say no again. There are times when people say no and they fight back. And that happens to individuals, and it happens to groups, and it happens in fields and locker rooms and prisons. And there are times when people feel threatened, either physically, where somebody says that they'll hurt them, or they just feel like they're in an unsafe situation where if they do say no, something will happen to them. There are times when people will say, I'll break up with you if you don't have sex with me, or I'll tell everyone that you're a slut if you don't have sex with me. And there are times when we're unable to give consent, when we're too young, or when we have had too much to drink, whether it be us drinking too much ourselves or having too much alcohol fed to us, or we're passed out, or we've been given a date rape drug. And while there's this whole spectrum of unconsensual sex acts that can happen, there's also a whole spectrum of people that this type of act happens with. It's men and it's women, it's old people, it's younger people, it's people who just do this once, and it's people who do it all the time. It is our friend, it is our lover. It is a guy who's been taught that no means convince me, and doesn't realize that what he's doing is wrong and just think it's part of male courtship. There are women and men who think, oh, you're a guy, so of course you want it, because that's what guys do, they want sex. So they don't even really think about the fact that maybe this might not be totally consensual. There are times when people are just idiots and where they, in the moment, forget that they are interacting with another person and are so involved in their own desires that they completely ignore what the other person wants. And there are people who knowingly commit one of the worst acts against other people. But there are all these different types and spectrums of ways in which they can happen. Now, part of the problem is when we talk about sexual assault, and we talk about sexual assault, say, happening on a campus, we think of that classic definition, and we think, well, nobody I know would hold a gun to somebody else's head and force them to have sex with them. None of my friends would do that, so it can't be something that happens here. It can't be something that happens in my community. And when these things happen to ourselves, they don't fit this mold that we're taught to think of when we think of sexual assault. And so we don't necessarily want to take on that label because we don't feel like it's our label to take. We also don't necessarily want to define ourselves as victims. We don't want to think of ourselves in that way. And we often don't really want to talk about it. We don't want to share it with our parents. We don't want to march in the defense of ourselves. We don't want to share it with our lovers or often even our friends, because we don't want you to feel sorry for us. We don't want you to worry. We don't want you to see us as weak or broken when we've tried so hard to be strong and whole. So what do we do about it? What do we do about this problem when we can't even define what the problem is, when we don't have a shared definition of what the problem is or how frequently it occurs? So one idea is that we create a website. We create a website where we can start to have this conversation, where people who have experienced all sorts of non-consensual sex can share their stories. Now, that can be posting a video yourself about you've experienced it. Or it can be writing in what happened to you and having someone else embody that, having someone else take that story and videotape themselves telling your story. And it can be a friend, it can be a stranger, it can maybe even be a celebrity. And in this way, we can start to describe as a society what is this thing that is happening? What is the spectrum of this thing that can happen? And we can actually hear and see these stories. And maybe it doesn't have to end there. Maybe it can also be a tool where we can create in-person support groups, in-person advocacy groups, where we on a local level can meet and decide what we want to do about this in our community. Maybe we can also use it to crowdsource ideas for solutions, where anybody who's submitting a video or a script can also put in ideas for policies or programs or technologies that they think would have prevented it from happening in the first place or would have helped them afterwards. And we can take these ideas and we can give them to policymakers, we can give them to funders, we can give them to people who can create these technologies to try to help and solve this problem. And we can use the power of the internet. And the amazing thing about the internet is that it gives everybody a mask and a microphone. And particularly around areas around sexual health and well-being, this is so important because there's so many stigmatized issues in this area that we're not comfortable speaking about. Now, in 2 months and 9 days, I will be the same age my sister was when she died. And if I was to do one thing with the last 2 months and 9 days of my life, it would be to be here on the stage, giving this speech and talking to you and encouraging you to find your problem that you want to solve. Find the thing that makes you angry. Find the thing that makes your heart break. Find the thing that makes you want to claw and scream, and that you think, how can this be happening in this world? How can this be happening in this country when we've come so far on so many other things? Go out there, find your problem, and solve it. And don't let anyone else stop you. And most of all, don't stop yourself. Don't not apply for something because you think you can't get it. Don't not try something because you think you'll fail. Don't not reach out to somebody else for help because you think they won't give it. Because while theory is amazing and good and great, and it helps us totally understand problems comprehensively and how they all fit together, it is passion and not theory that leads to action. So at the age of 17, I decided that I wanted to change the world. And now, today, at the age of 27, 4 months, and 12 days, I would like to invite you to try to change it with me. Thank you.